Welcome everybody to another developer interview here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel and our latest Perceptive podcast. I'm of course Josh Bycer and we have another great interview lined up tonight. My guests are from the studio Klei Entertainment, which I am sure everyone here watching is well aware of. They are the makers of course, Don't Starve, Invisible Ink, Oxygen Not Included, and the game that we're going to be discussing tonight, Griftlands. Their latest in kind of a deck building meets RPG with a lot of story elements and a lot of people getting beaten up in that game. So, please welcome to the cast, Kevin and Rasmus. How are you guys doing?
Hi, we're very hot because we're on the West Coast right now.
I'm very hot. I'm on the East Coast here in the United States. We're having who's having it worse right now. But it is great to have you guys back on, or have you guys on. I think Kevin and I, we may have spoken like a very long time ago, like right around the Don't Starve hour, which is like, what, like 45 years ago, like in game dev years?
Well, yeah, more like 60 or so for us on the inside.
Yeah,
Yeah, time moves differently in game dev.
it does. But it's great to have both of you on. For the people watching us live right now, if you have any questions for Kevin and Rasmus about Klei, about Griflins, anything like that, let us know in the description, or I'm sorry, in the comments, and we'll get to them as they come in. So, since it has been a while since Kevin and I spoke, and since it's your first time on, Rasmus, could you both like share a little bit about who you are, what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Sure. So I'm Kevin. I work at Klei Entertainment. Been in the industry, oh gosh, since like 2005 or so. Started as a programmer, started to wear more hats over time. I don't know what I am now. I make games.
There you go.
My name is Rasmus. I worked on Griftlands, and that was actually the first project for me at Klei. I've been there for 2.5 years now, and it is kind of my introduction to the industry. So it's been an interesting journey.
Mm-hmm. Conrad said wants to know, can he get a job? There's a lot of Klei fans in the audience, I'm sure here.
Not, yeah, wrong person to ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess first question for you, Kevin. Like I said, like we last spoke right around Don't Starve when it first came out. Did you work on any of the other projects, like or anything like that since we last spoke?
Yeah, I was actually the writer on Invisible Ink.
Nice.
Came in late on that one and kind of put together the narrative and figured out where that was all going. I think there was, I mean, it's game that there's always some canceled projects. Like every game that actually makes it has a couple that didn't quite, behind it. So there was some stuff like that, and then other than that, it's been Griftlands for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. And for you, Rasmus, what aspect of Grifflins did you work on?
Most of the design. I joined right when it became a card game, and got to experiment a lot with that. So I've worked on cards for all of the characters, sort of the mechanics of both card games.
Nice. And we are certainly going to be talking about the design and such of the cards in this cast for sure. So I have a few fans who are watching who also really enjoy deck builders and roguelike style games like that. So this should get very interesting when we get to that point. So I guess next question, and either one of you can answer. For people watching us who have not heard of Grifflands, what is the game for those people?
Yes, that's me. So, oh gosh, you think I'd have this memorized by now? It's a space swashbuckler game where you play through a series of characters, each with their own stories, and you try to come to some goal for all of them. Like one's looking for revenge, the other is working a deal, and the other one's trying to get his inheritance. And then it's a mixture of kind of procedurally generated and remixed and handcrafted narrative that aims to be very replayable. And then when you actually talk to people or when you fight, you use cards, and you build two different decks as you go on based on your behaviors and how people see you in the world and your actions. And then those two decks are how you express yourselves in the battles and the conversations.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, and I did post my review of Griftlands, I would say maybe 3 weeks ago from the time of this recording. It is certainly a different take on kind of the deck builder style games. Like, for people watching, like when we play games like Monster Train Slay the Spire, they're usually like very compartmentalized, 40 minutes to an hour long runs. With Grifflins, like a good play can easily take over an hour and a half, maybe even pushing more if you're really reading into all the dialogue. I guess for either one of you or both of you, what was kind of like the approach of designing Grifflins? Like, how did you want to build this as, a deck building game, a story driven game, or, a combination of the two?
Well, if I had to sum up, like, I guess Klei's and probably my own game design philosophy in one word, it would be iteration.
Mm-hmm.
So we're a little different, and again, I've worked at Klei most of my career, so Rasmus comes in and tells me like this is weird, but we don't really make the map before we set out on the journey, right? Like we have a vague idea, and we explore that idea, and we write supporting documents as we go along, and then we try to seek and find the fun as we go. So like as kind of Rasmus alluded to, I mean Griftlands was in development for something like 5 years in one form or another, and the whole card aspect of it came in relatively late, maybe two and a half, maybe 3 years ago, something like that, as a solution to a particular design problem that we were having at the time. So yeah, like it's just iteration, lots of iteration.
Anyone add, Rasmus? No, I think that sums it up quite well. And I think it was also it kind of turned into more wrangling your deck in the right direction rather than some other deck builders. You kind of reset all the time trying to get just the right RNG and just the right cards. Where Griftlands, the aim at least, was that you could pivot and try to make the best out of what you get.
Mm-hmm. And I guess a question for you. You said that you came on Klei, like Griflins being your first project. Is Griflins like your first like commercial game, or have you worked on other projects in the past?
This is my first commercial game, yeah.
Nice. And a question from, I think, what was her name? Very Russian Corn. I wanted to ask, what is your opinion on fan content? Do you have favorites?
It's a loaded question. I love fan content. If you walk by when we had desks, this is my bedroom. But when we had desks, if you walk by my desk at work, you would see I'd be like looking at Twitter, usually looking for back in the day Don't Starve content, or like nowadays Griftlands content. I love to see it. I love to see people take the worlds that we create and extend them. And I mean, they're definitely, because we also embrace early access a lot. Like there is some interplay there where we put something out and we see what people respond to, and then again, as part of the iteration, it's like those parts of the games kind of bubble to the surface. As for favorites, they're all good. They're all good fan contents.
So, getting back to Grifflins, and I'm happy that you mentioned early access, Kevin, because I know when we spoke about Don't Starve, like this was one of the major points about Klei, that the studio has certainly really embraced early access as kind of part of its development strategy, and as you said a few minutes ago, about constantly iterating on ideas. So, with Grifflins, I guess my next question is, how has the game, or has it changed at all from kind of like the original concept when you guys and Klei kind of first came up with it?
Well, I mean, like the original concept was, I guess, if you're a game developer of a certain vintage, you want to make that game, and that game is the every game, right? It's like the game where it's open world and you can do this and you can do that, and it's kind of like Sid Meier's Pirates back in the day, and kind of like Elite Dangerous, like it's that game. It's usually set in space. And it always fails. It always fails. Sometimes a good game can come out of it, but it's not that game. No one has ever made that game. And we tried. That was kind of like in the beginning, I was like, no, we will do it. We'll make that game. And I wrote some documents and we kind of set off. And then years passed and that game had not arisen yet. We had done many rabbit holes. Like I remember at one point I was programming supply and demand curves for commodity trading that would reflect your actions. So like if you're walking around on the map and you intercepted a shipment of goods to a factory and you stole them, then that would change the price down the line in these other locations. And I was really pleased with myself. I got that working, and like you could bring up debug tools and you could look at the little graphs change, and I could show people, and they'd be like, okay, what is it like for the player? And I'm like, well, it wasn't. It wasn't for the player. It was for me. So we kind of had a reckoning at one point where it was like, you know what, this isn't quite this game that we attempted is just it's too much. It's too much. The world we built is interesting. The art is fantastic, but like a game, we need to stop like running around in circles and trying to make every system imaginable and make it these abstract concepts kind of interesting to the player, and actually knuckle down and make something that people want to play. So that's when the cards came in. Originally, the first cards to come in were the negotiation cards, and the reason that those went in is we had dialogue in the game. We had branching dialogue, very very kind of standard. And if you played like kind of like the older, like Baldur's Gate era, kind of like D&D inspired conversation games, there'll be the option where it's like, use this skill, and because they're kind of directly from old tabletop, you'd roll a dice with the computer, and it'd be like 30% chance you can convince this guy to do a thing for you, and that's fine. Like it works. It gives the player some agency. They feel really good when they can do it. But it's pretty. If you fail it, it's not your fault. Like I guess you could have built more towards that, but even if you like built up your conversational skill to like 90% chance of winning, 10% chance you're not going to get it, and it's not going to be your fault. It's just random. So we tried to think of a way to make conversational pushes like that interactive, and have it be based upon player performance. Like I want to actually feel like I can squeeze out a tight victory if I can barely get it, or I can express myself while I'm trying to perform this task rather than just rolling the virtual dice. And we went through a bunch of prototypes. We tried some literal dice-based ones, like it was like dice in a cup, and you put more dice in depending and pull it out, and you had special actions and parallel economies of like favor tokens and all this stuff. Again, iteration. We tried lots of things, and then eventually we kind of ended up with the card game, kind of inspired by Dominion. Games like Slay the Spire popularized it a lot, but I guess is it deck hand building? The game where you'll pull the whole cards into your hand, and then they go to your discard and then shuffles around. I forget the technical term for it. But that seemed to work pretty well. And then we iterated on that some more, and we ended up having like deployable arguments and all this, and then finding ways to kind of weave that into the narrative itself, so it feels like you're actually doing at least a little bit what your character is trying to do. And then that actually worked pretty well. And we had at the time we had that, and we had kind of like JRPG inspired combat almost. With like, I think it was like Grandia more than anything else. It had like burn down timers for actions and all this stuff, and it was fine. Like it wasn't anything anyone would be too excited about. Probably like we actually took it to PAX in like 2017, I want to say, and like it was playable, but there wasn't kind of a spark there, and like again, it felt more like I play my best attack every time, and eventually the health bar goes down, kind of thing. So given our experience with the negotiation card game, we thought, well, why don't we just do two? Why don't we see if this works for combat? And so we did. We tried a couple things with like teammates and mixing decks and whatever, and we eventually settled upon the system that you just can play in the game now. And then since then, it's been pretty straightforward once the card mechanics were in place. Yeah, it's just been a small incremental progress, and then adding lots of content. Like I love that part of a project where the kind of the core design questions are solved and answered, and then you just like, okay, now we make content and we balance the content and we try to make stuff that's engaging for people to actually play with. But we're not answering like fundamental questions like what kind of game are we?
Yeah, it's important to get that answered very quickly in game development, as I'm sure everyone here is well aware of. And you gave me a lot of like really good like points for like follow up questions there, Kevin. I'm trying to think where to start with. I guess here's one thing. This is more of a general game dev question. With like as you said, with like how the original concept for Griflins was, and that kind of need to iterate and change it. I guess for developers listening to us, how did like you and the team kind of come to that decision of, yes, I like this, but I don't think this is going to work from a design standpoint? Because I feel like this is something I think a lot of developers tend to struggle with. That the whole, it's your baby. When's it time to throw the baby out? I guess.
Yeah, it can be hard because everyone comes to a different conclusion at a different time for that, and like kind of just honest and open discussion about it. I mean, you can't argue with the pages on your calendar turning. Like eventually, it's like, okay, this isn't a game yet, so something's wrong. We need to change something. Thankfully, at Klei, like Klei is organized. We have multiple projects going on at one time, and there's kind of like an oversight, high level oversight for all the projects, and like eventually, they kind of step in and be like, okay, guys, let's let's throw the baby out or change the water, and that's kind of what happened with us. You need to save the game developer from themselves.
Yeah. So, talking about getting to kind of like discussion about the card system. One of the things I like, the idea of having like gamifying conversations, like gamifying non-combat options, is something that I find interesting. I think right around the time I think we spoke about Don't Starve, I remember playing the game Renowned Explorers. This was like a tactical RPG where their whole thing was you could either beat people up or you could, emotionally manipulate them and use like and try to like get around combat like that. Now their system, it was all kind of one the same. So my attack skill would kind of function the same way as my conversational skill, but with Griftlands, as you said, like it really comes down to like two distinct systems. So the first question I want to ask is, I guess, what was the approach to design the cards around negotiation, like building that system up specifically to be used with a deck builder?
It's Rasmus who might be that.
Okay, yeah, I can take that. Yeah, I remember negotiation early days was a lot like combat. You kind of each had a health bar, and we actually worked on a bunch of different concepts for negotiation before we like sat down and had a long discussion and finally figured out the argument system that we have now. And then we tried to. I remember at one point there was like using hostile cards would make the person dislike you. But that always, at some point during a playthrough, came at odds with the quest you were doing or the context of the negotiations. And instead, we decided to sort of keep a theme on the different negotiation archetypes, and then have, you can still intimidate people, but that's only in the context of the quest that you intimidate them. So I think kind of separating the conversation from the arguing, and it's more that you were trying to convince someone, right? Rather than saying specific things to them.
Yeah, like I think it's very important that it took us a while to find like the proper level of abstraction. Because like, obviously it'd be amazing if like every card furthered the conversation along this like branching path and it was all written. But again, that's kind of in that game territory where I don't think you could actually accomplish that. Although some people have gotten close. I think like Signs of the Sojourner. That game does a really good job of doing conversations where the cards actually matter a little more to the overall. So yeah, we did decide to segment it so that you make your decision, which is going to have an impact upon your relationships and all that at the outside. Like I am going to intimidate you, or I am going to convince you, and then you get in, and then yeah, you're convincing them by using all your aggressive cards, but hand wave, it's probably fine.
And Another part that I found interesting is that with Griflins, like the negotiation system, there is no like actual penalty for failing it, or penalty as in if I run out of the health resource for it, the run ends. Was there an original version, or was there some version where you had to actually manage both health bars? Like if either one of them hit zero, it was game over.
Well, we thought about that because like the obvious question is like what happens when you run out of that
Mm-hmm.
your resolve, and we couldn't think of a convincing reason that would feel satisfying for like I tried to convince my friend to help me move, and they said no, so I'm just done, game over. Like narratively, like because the game strives for immersion, and seeing a game over screen at that would be odd. So it kind of just, again, through iteration, through feel and kind of intuition, like it kind of became this, okay, well, conversations are kind of like your shield and shield strength, and combat is more like your whole strength. And the one recharges the other too. There is some interplay between the decks. Like if you win a conversation in a certain way, you'll get combat cards, and vice versa. And whenever you win a fight, your character's amped up and more sure of themselves, so their resolve goes back up. So it's like the game tries at least to push you to use a combination of the two, and not neglect any one deck.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Question from Rat's Tail asked, they have an old game they keep going back to, and it's just not practical. Like, how do you handle games like that? I guess that would be more of a game dev question.
Oh, game.
Yeah.
If it's a hobby project, then there's nothing wrong with having a long-standing labor of love, right? Like, I mean, that's how we get Dwarf Fortress. you know um I mean, if it's a commercial project, then you got bills to pay. So so there's just certain realities that will kind of like force your hand. But I mean, it's totally healthy to have both of those things going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So, with the negotiation system and kind of having like the arguments, like it really did feel like a different kind of deck builder, a different kind of game. Like, was that system inspired by any other like deck building games, or is any other games in general?
Jason,
The arguments.
Yeah.
I think that was kind of a collective idea that we came up with. There was a lot of input and a lot of inspirations from different games. Wasn't one of them was actually Hearthstone, because you have minions, and we were like, well, how can we? Because negotiations are always one-on-one as opposed to fights. How can we give you a way to kind of distract your opponent or not have them always be attacking you? Because otherwise, it very much becomes attack, defend, attack, defend. And I think I know a lot of us also played Dominion, the physical card game, and I think the use of resources in that was kind of an inspiration for a lot of the, at least, dominance and influence in the negotiation system.
yeah, I think like the main idea was to give you a choice of targeting, because yeah, like if a fight is if the game only presents one-on-one fights, then it really, your only choice is which attack to do, not which attack and where to apply it. So it just gives you a little bit more to think about, another dimension to think on as a player as you evaluate each turn.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that this will be a good segue, talking a little bit more about combat. Now I want to kind of bring up some of the character designs as well. So the combat system definitely feels more relatable to some of the other deck builders we've played. Good guys on the left, bad guys on the right, throw cards, and hopefully you survive. That kind of thing. As you said, like the original concept for Griflins was going to be focusing more on the negotiation side, and the combat system came later. Did the combat system go through, outside of course you said like having like the JRPG kind of background or original design, did it go through any other iterations in terms of that system specifically?
Well, I know that the very first combat system we had, because like, I mean, Griftlands was this sprawling back game, and originally it was like you'd run into someone and then it'd say combat question mark, and you hit enter, and then we'd flip coins and you'd win or lose. Right, and then like that just got replaced. At one point there was like a hex-based system with positioning, and then it was replaced with character pod. They called them pogs, but it was like little pictures of them on a circle, and they would fight, and they were in different ranks, and like there was a lot of iteration on bad combat designs. But I think that like the through line though was to have like something a little bit deeper than just reduce the health bar of the other side. So like we have the morale system, we have a difference, like a metagame difference between killing and accepting surrender. And it kind of like interplays with the relationship system and all this other stuff. Because like there's nothing I find more boring in a game where it's just like I just try to defeat this thing and it tries to defeat me, and then it's either I'm going to win or it's going to win. That's the only way it can end. Like I'm very interested in terms of design, in terms of like gray areas of result. So like I beat them up, but I did it in such a way that everybody around me hates me because that guy did that thing. Is kind of interesting. You don't normally see that in a game, and we're trying to get a little splash of that into Griftlands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, I definitely have a few questions about that system, but before we get there, like talking more about the actual combat system itself, how did the team approach the card design for the combat versus negotiation? Because for those of you watching, of course, Griflins features 3 main characters, so that's 3 different distinct styles of play.
That'll be for you, Rasmus.
Okay, sure. So I guess we completely finished Sal before we started making Rook and Smith. And while developing Sal, we went a lot of different directions with cards until we figured out what kind of worked. And I think the design process that worked for us was focusing on specific themes. So Sal is usually either combo or bleed, and then discard came in later. And those just kind of seem to fit aesthetically with the character and with her personality, and then we try to build mechanics around that, build conditions around that make sense. And I mean, at the end of the day, all card mechanics are kind of going to boil down to like damage per turn or reduction of some number. There's a lot of different ways to sort of frame that to make it more interesting, and make it fit the character a bit more. And then it was just a ton of iteration and a ton of input from everyone. There's a lot of playtesting, different versions, and a lot of card ideas that didn't work. So we kind of picked the best ones and then ran with that.
Usually my card ideas were the ones that didn't work. Like, hey guys, what if this card didn't? No, Kevin, no, that won't work.
Let's see. Rat tells how many cards does each character have?
Ooh. Lots.
That is a good question.
Yeah, I haven't counted lately. Many. I'd have to look it up.
I think it's somewhere around 100 for each deck type. I believe.
But they all
also
upgrade in 2 directions as well.
Yes. There's all the card up. If you count all of the card upgrades and all the items and stuff like that, there's a lot more. In the game, we do have a compendium where you can look through all of them to kind of get an overview.
And speaking about the upgrade system, if you could clarify this for me, when the card does upgrade, does it pick from like 2 random upgrade paths, or does each card have like 2 distinct upgrade paths?
It depends on the card.
Okay.
Your starting basic cards have kind of if you look at them in the compendium, it'll tell you they have kind of a pooled upgrade. So like for like your basic stab SL, I think there's about 10 variations that it'll pick 2 of those for this particular card, this particular run. For the cards that you draft though, like they generally just have 2.
Okay.
And that was just to give a little more variation, because everybody starts with the starting cards. Like you want a little more direction that can go in.
And it was also to avoid, in a lot of deck builders, like your starting cards, you just kind of want to get rid of by the end of the run. Like if you still have those cards at the end of the run, you probably did something wrong. Yeah. Whereas, Sal's Stab, if you're upgrading it into a Stab with Bleed and you're making a Bleed deck, that's perfect. You can keep that forever and it'll still work.
And speaking about the upgrade system, one thing that I found very interesting was you had the option of you can upgrade the card so it does a whole lot of damage, but then it destroys the card or removes it from your deck. And as you just said, as like fans of deck builders who are watching probably know, card removal is an essential point of a lot of these games. You don't want to have fat in your deck, especially if you're trying to go for those specific strategies. I guess, what was the decision to have that option? Because it's not something we normally see in deck builders. Usually, if you're going to have deck removal, it's at a shop, it's a limited event, it's something along those lines.
I think we have all those ways too.
Yeah.
It was just another. I mean, when you have to come up with that many card upgrade ideas, you throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. So that was just one of them. It's like, yeah, that's perfect, great. Because you don't see it all the time either. You can't rely upon it. It's just odds are you'll get one or two card that would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, I think it kind of streamlines your removal a little bit, so that instead of always using your removal options on your base cards, you might take a chance and pick a bleed card early, and then you just find combo cards after, and you're like, okay, well that's fine because I can still remove that bleed card. It's not like your removal is not reserved for your basic deck.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question that I'm sure you guys have been asked by people before. Like, do you have a favorite character or favorite deck style when you played Griflins?
I mean, Smith's fun.
Yeah.
Slug, alien, Kradeshi that you get at the last. He's written to be the fun one. So he's kind of fun. He eats a sandwich and then poops out money. That kind of game.
Nice. You, Rasmus?
I think Smith is definitely my favorite character. In terms of card play, I think Sal's discard deck is one of the most satisfying for me to use. I just really enjoy setting up all the little parts of it and getting kind of an engine going. But yeah, Smith, both character-wise and story-wise, is definitely my favorite. He was a lot of fun to work on as well, which is part of it.
Yeah, and it's always interesting when you have the different personalities of the characters come into play. I like a Rook with his whole coin mechanic, and just adding that little extra layer of RNG when you're using his negotiations. I guess, speaking about that, with coming up with the different styles for each character, as you said, there's easily 100 cards or 100 cards per style, per character kind of thing like that. Were there any specific build types that you guys came up with that kind of were left on the cutting room floor, that weren't integrated into the game?
I have to think back. Sal's development was, it's kind of like a band's first album, right? It's Sal's development was 4 years, and all the stuff that got winnowed down into Sal, and then we had to do two more pretty quickly. So at the beginning of those two, at Rook and Smith, we'd have everybody in a room meetings back when you could do that, and it would be writing on the whiteboard, okay, what if we did this kind of thing, and we'd talk through what would be the implication of a deck built around that. Would that work with the other one? And then we'd usually pick two to start with, because you don't want just one. It's that's pay by numbers, build that deck. So you'd start with two, and then we play that a little bit, get that out there, and eventually at the Smith level, it'd be public. We would engage the players as well. And then usually the third mechanic would kind of come in later, in response to how we see people using the existing cards and what would be interesting, what would be in contrast to the other ones. As for specific mechanics, I can't remember anything, but Rasmus, do you?
Well, I have a couple of things. One of the things is that I think we have some very talented artists and animators on the team, and a lot of the inspiration for how a character fights kind of came from what would look good visually and what fits their style. And then we would kind of be like, okay, well, how can we take this really cool looking thing and also make it fun to use? As for mechanics that are gone, I remember Rook was a lot of trial and error. I remember he used to load different bullets into his gun, very early days. That was not fun at all. So as much as I wish I could have gotten that to work, I'm glad it's not in the game anymore.
I guess in general, it's usually a process of here's this really complicated thing, and you need these three cards to line up, and then you do this, and that's great. And then we actually try that out, and it's no, this never happens. This is just too much. And then it's a process of simplification, finding the core of the good idea in those things and simplifying it down to something that's understandable by players and that we can show like visually as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Another question came in, and for any new people joining, yes, definitely feel free to ask any questions for Kevin and Rasmus, and we'll answer them as they come in. But let's see. Kindness Timmy asked, any opinion on mods coming out like Arint, ARINT?
Oh, area. There's a really detailed mod about it's like a full campaign for one of the bosses. It's pretty awesome. Yeah, mods are great. We love mods. It can be, I mean, honestly, like as a programmer, it can be a little challenging not to break everybody's mod every time you update, and like that's why we don't start with modding support ever. We want the game to be, and the systems and the programming of the game to be at a certain state where we're pretty sure we're not going to change the underlying stuff, and then we kind of turn on the tap and add workshop support and get people started on that. But yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, like anytime someone takes, time out of the limited time they have on Earth to pay attention to your thing, and then they like it so much that they make something in that universe and try to give back, it's amazing. It's an amazing feeling.
So, getting back to kind of the combat system, another thing I want to ask about in terms of the card design is kind of like your version of, I guess, the quote-unquote like common or like universal cards. Like there's something that we see in a lot of deck builders where each faction or class has their own set, and then you can buy cards that are kind of like the wild cards, or they're the factionless cards. So in Griflins, of course, you can find them at shops. You can sometimes get them from character rewards, and some of them have like limited time use. Some of them can be used infinitely. What was like given like the narrative and the character design of the card systems, how did the general cards like kind of fit into that?
They're mostly items. Is that right,
Yes.
Rasmus? Yeah, they're items or loot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of death loot, with a lot of items. I think initially, because we just had Sal when we were making Rook, we carried over a lot of the items, and at some point it was like, well, it can't just be the same for every campaign. So there's a lot of items and death loot that's specific to a campaign, or specific to a certain character class.
I mean, they can leak into each other in unforeseen ways.
Yeah,
the content goes in brawl mode, for example. But yeah, like you tend to find bog stuff in Rook's campaign, like New Deltree stuff and Sal's campaign.
Okay, and I guess making them like limited, were there any specific like bounds concerns in terms of how much do I want this item to matter versus it's like a 2-shot or a 3-shot and then it's out of your deck forever?
I think it was we just wanted them to be impactful and temporary. They're like grenades. I mean, a lot of them literally are grenades.
Yeah.
But but yeah, it's like hey, here's an item. Don't think too hard about adding it to your deck. You can remove it for free if you want. And you can just use it up, and it'll get out of your way. It was meant to be a supplement to your built deck.
Yeah, I think a big part of it was also being able to give out a reward for something without like permanently altering your deck. Because if you, in any deck builder, if you offer the player a card, they're going to think about like, am I going to use this? Do I need it? Is it going to be bloat? With items, you can just remove it from your deck, or you can use it up and it'll get removed on its own. So it's a nice kind of little reward that's not just money that you can give the player.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, another question from Rat's Tail. How do you think is the best way to enable and support mods at a technical level?
Workshop's pretty good. We've had a lot of success with our games in Workshop. I mean, without that, I mean, the other thing that helps is that Griftlands, most of the code, vast majority of the code is in Lua, and it's in plain text. The game kind of ships as a collection of zip files, and one of them is called scripts or data scripts.zip. Open that up, and there's a game, and you can read it all. You can study it. Don't look too closely; it'll make you a bad programmer. But yeah, it's right there for you to poke at. Right. Oh, and debugging tools, like the same debugging tools that we use. Like we have a integrated console. You type if you start the game up in debug mode by going -- debug, you can go Control tilde, and it pulls down a REPL. So you can just type Lua in there, explore, and then we have all sorts of like kind of Lua-based inspectors for all the stuff in the game. So the tools that we use are freely available.
All right. So, I guess we've spoken about combat. I think this is a good time to talk about the other side of Griftlands, and that's kind of more the story or campaign progression. And one of the big things that kind of separates Griftlands from the other deck builders we've played is definitely the character interactions. You mentioned, of course, earlier that, if you fight somebody and you kill them, everybody around you kind of hates you for that. And the whole kind of relationship system is kind of like one part of the relic or artifact system that we see in other deck builders. That you get some item and it changes how your character behaves. With Grifflands, as you said, like originally it was going to be more of like this open world epic kind of game. How did like the whole like conversation or like the whole, I guess, alignment or ligament kind of character relationship system come into play?
Well, it's the result of iteration, to be a broken record, and simplification. When it was the sprawling game with more systems than players, there was this screen you could go into, and it looked like like a spy movie when they have the cork board, or like a procedural movie, and they'll have like this person knows this person. There's a line between them, and then this. We had that, and it was this screen, and everyone would show up on it, and everyone had an opinion of everybody at all times, kind of like Crusader Kings. But we would show it all, and you could move things around, and it was all on springs. It was very tactile. It would make it wobble. It was kind of fun, but utterly inscrutable. Like you looked at it, you're like, well, what happens if oh gosh, I can't actually, yeah. It's like, well, if I anger this person, then their friend's that person, but their other second degree friend is this person, and then but they're enemies of this person, and so by net, and it's just like galaxy brain stuff. And we couldn't make a fun game out of that in the time that we spent on it. But the idea of like, everyone has a friend, and your ideas have like the player's experience of like, if I kill someone, which is, I mean, it's broad strokes, but it's a video game, right? If I kill someone, their friend's going to dislike me. Well, I mean, the dark secret of Griftlands is that person doesn't have a friend before you killed them. We actually find that person at runtime once you kill them, right? Because it's much easier to show you, like, like you're going to have someone, it's going to be in their faction. You can kind of predict what kind of boon or bane it's going to be. But there will be a result if you do it. If you leave it up to simulation, then you have the corkboard with like the dozens of characters, all fully connected graph. And you need to have that simulate, and it needs to look good and be right. And then it also needs to set up before the game starts. And like half of those people you're probably not going to meet in the course of a runtime. So it's just wasted effort and overhead. It bloats your save file and makes your computer run slower. But then also, like in terms of development, like you need to get that right. You need to get that simulation right. And then you need to get that simulation fun. And those are two very different tasks. And they're often incompatible tasks. So like, what the tack that I took was that what matters is what surfaces to the player. And if it seems consistent to the player and it seems deep to the player, then it is consistent and it is deep, and they will interact with it. So yeah, it's very much like a simulation from the surfaces inwards rather than a core like system that then you kind of put a game on top of.
And the whole kind of, like and hate kind of system and having that drive the decision making, I guess, in terms of like that kind of influence, because one of the things about Grifflands I think kind of separates it from other deck builders that we've played here is that it's usually not one thing that's going to, make or break your run. We've played plenty of deck builders where, quote unquote, Heart of the Cards comes and we get that one magic card, that one artifact, and then suddenly the run is possible. With Grifflands, it's definitely a lot of, success by 1,000 cuts or death by 1,000 cuts. What was kind of the decision or the thought process behind, how much you want the buffs and the nerfs, and the, what are they called, the things that you can install in your head, like those artifacts?
Grafts.
Yeah, the grafts. Like, what was the decision about, like, how much you wanted them to be impacting how the game plays out?
Well, I mean, like the graphs in particular have a rarity. Like there's boss graphs some characters can get at certain times, and those shape quite a bit. I mean, like Griftlands is a really weird beast, right? Like it's got this huge like narrative end and immersion end, and it's got this deck building end, and like the two parts of the game often seem to be fighting each other. And like if you're really in like your thing in games is deck builders or your thing in games is just straight up narrative, you might you might not like when the other half of the game kind of impinges upon the part that you're really liking. So like like as a pure deck builder, like it's there are compromises made in terms of that to support the narrative, and in terms of narrative, there are compromises made to support the other half as well. So it really like we didn't want to dictate too much for the choices that the player would make. Like, I mean, I guess like as a designer, the thing that I love the most to make a player do is make a choice between how they feel and what they want. So like they're playing this game. We use all the designer tricks in the book that we know to make them feel something for these characters. Like Chester and Don't Starve, or or like Marif, the poor bartender who's put upon by Smith. But then like we give you the constant ability to portray them for mechanical gain, and like most people won't do that, right? Some people will do that, and then they'll feel bad afterwards. But like that tension there is interesting to me, because it's like is this a game? Does anything matter? Like I mean, we're building stories and we're letting you inhabit these stories, and like on some level, they do have to matter a little bit to you. Otherwise, I mean, you're just playing like a spreadsheet, right? So yeah, like I think like if you look at it, like almost all the games that I've been involved in, that there's always this tension, where it's like two halves of the game kind of forced together that are fighting, but the fighting is good in how you experience it and the choices that it tries to make you make.
Okay. And another part, like in terms of like balance, like we haven't really spoken too much about like the enemy designs. I'll get to a Rat's Tail question after this one, but in terms of designing the enemies that players are coming up with, like we've seen different approaches with deck builders. Some will make the enemies like very similar to the players. Other games will just go, this enemy will use abilities that you will never ever have access to. What was kind of like the approach and like how you settle on what you want enemies to do in Griftlands?
I can talk a bit about that, I
Yeah.
guess.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I actually just remembered that I'd totally forgotten about this, but enemies used to have cards. You used to see their cards, and they used to play them from their hand, which was interesting. It was nice to see that parallel between the player and the enemy. Until you realize that the enemy is doing really stupid things with their cards, because you can see their cards. You're like, well, that's not what you should be doing. But it also was a little bit weird than the player wants that, and how do you figure out how that works? And if they're all just kind of boring cards, why are they even there? And that's kind of where we ended up going, was why do we need to show this card? And instead, we made attacks more focused on how they affect the player. Specifically for bosses, they almost all have some unique mechanic that they apply to the player, or a unique buff they give themselves that you have to interact with in some way. And I think interaction was one of the big things, particularly for the bleed condition. The player can apply bleed to enemies, but if an enemy applies bleed to the player, you actually get bleed cards. Because that way you have something to interact with. If it's just a debuff on you that takes down, it's something you have to consider, but it's not really anything you can do much about. And I think that was the approach to most of our enemies and most of the bosses, was how do we give something the player can do, like give them almost a side objective during the fight.
Yeah, I think that, like, to kind of build on that, I think that single player games for me are kind of inherently asymmetric. Like we don't have to care about fairness for the AI. Like they exist so that the player can have fun and to present interesting challenges. And like, their AI is more about acting than it is about winning. We don't like if they wanted to win, they could. If we wanted to make them win every time, they could, but that wouldn't be any fun. So yeah, it is really just about crafting an experience for the player and giving them like the bleed is a perfect example of like, like having a status effect you can't do anything about. It's like, yeah, having more decisions, more cards to play is more interesting.
And the bosses definitely have, like, as you said, they can be very different. Like, they can certainly be a difficulty spike if you're not prepared for them. I made it to the end of Sal's campaign. I thought, yeah, my deck is pretty good. And then the boss just, like, casually did, like, 28 points of damage in a single turn. Like, yeah, I don't think my cards are going to be winning this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think for specifically for Casio, we also made a very deliberate decision that like both your decks matter at that point, right? You have to do well in the negotiation so that you can weaken her during the fight. And I think that was kind of an experiment at the start, but it worked out really well. Like stealing away items, it also felt more thoughtful than just win one, get an ally or something like that.
Yeah, Casio's she's a composite character. She has, I don't remember the exact number, but there's a big handful of items that are for the auction, and you can we pick from that list to populate a given run, so that it's different every time. And then whatever ones Casio ends up with end up buffing her, and whatever ones you get end up being cards that you can, usually item cards that you can kind of throw grenades with. So I think that like we have metrics and we watch like how many you win, and like there definitely are some difficulty spikes, but like surprisingly, like what's the win rate for Casio or something? It was up there. It was like 80%.
I don't know what it is post release, but it right when she came out, it was about 80% win.
Yeah. So I think that like it can be perceived as a huge difficulty spike if you brush off the auction or aren't paying attention to the specifics. So but yeah, like we struggled against like the player base for this game is either like really focused on cards and really good at cards, or like cards are whatever. I like the story and decisions and stuff, and balancing it for those two people is very hard. So like we struggled with like everyone's beating the bosses first try, like for a long time.
Yeah, but I definitely want to ask about kind of the replay value. That's something which I want to bring up in a few minutes. But we have a few questions that came in from chat. Let's see. So Rat's Tail asks, do you have a preference for working with a custom engine or a pre-made engine, I guess, with your games?
Which answer do you want? Ask either of us. You go first, Rasmus.
Well, I mean, I when I was studying, I used a bunch of different, game engines like Unity and Unreal, and a bunch of different Game Maker as well. And I've done a couple of game jams recently, and using an engine for small projects like that is definitely advantageous. Gets you right into the fun parts of game production, I'd say. That being said, the flexibility of having our own engine is quite nice.
Yeah, I mean, like obviously, like we operate on a smaller scale than a lot of other games, right? Like we're not a AAA game with 100 people working on that kind of thing. If you're doing that, either you have an existing engine that you use in house that you've got a team of engineers kind of working away at, or you're using Unreal or Unity or something like that. For us though, like our team never gets that big. It's a dozen at the high end or so. That's changes over time. Having a custom engine lets us have exactly what we want. And I mean, like the engine that runs Griftlands, I mean, it's the Don't Starve. It was Don't Starve. You can go back in Subversion all the way back to like initial check-in for Don't Starve, like back in 2011 or something like that. But it's been upgraded over time and changed and had like the rendering backend switched out a couple of times. But yeah, like for me, like because we're working in kind of the 2D space and like it's not, the technical requirements aren't like super arduous. And we have this engine that we've been using internally since 2011 or so for these games. Then I kind of prefer the custom thing, like just because like if you have a problem, I have some pretty smart colleagues who can fix it, you know, and I don't have to like pay for extra support or wait for other emails to come back or whatever. I just ask my colleague to fix it, and it gets fixed.
All right. Let's see. A few other questions from chat. Also, as a quick heads up for people watching, I'm noticing like OBS gave me some spikes. Let me know if the stream gets a little bubbly or things start to mess up. Don't know, maybe it could be the heat around or maybe frying the internet. Let's see. So, a few questions about, I guess, the character designs now. Kindness Temi asked, what gave the idea for Pundak, the dodgy scavenger?
Oh,
Well,
probably started as the mechanic, right?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the mechanics of that character was how it sort of started. We used a temporary character for a while,
Yeah.
as sort of a way to bring in items and crafts from a previous run, just because that was an interesting narrative point to have, and a cool little like special event for players to get every now and then, and also gave a perceived power spike, I think. You get a graft for free from your previous run, and you're like, oh, this is really good, but chances are it might not be perfect for your deck, and it doesn't skew the difficulty that much. I think visually, we had that in for a while, and then sat down with an artist. We were like, what's the weirdest, coolest looking, like mysterious person you can make? And it worked.
Yeah, so like started as mechanics, eventually got some art, eventually got some good writing from our amazing writer. Like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
it comes in layers.
All right. And then for another character, Very Russian Corn asked, what happened to Telvin, the original design where Nadan's face used to be?
How do you know about Telvin? These are
That's old.
characters. Yeah, it's really. I don't think that was ever released. Yeah, no, I mean, like we had a lot of when kind of the Griftlands apocalypse happened, and we were like, okay, we're gonna make this game completable. We had a lot of art on the table. We had a lot of heads, like because our characters are kind of like bodies and heads, and they're largely interchangeable, right? And like we just had lots of heads sitting around, and they got repurposed into other characters as needed, so as not to waste the effort because the art was fine.
All right. As a quick time check, we are just about at an hour in. So I probably have another maybe 15, 20 questions for myself. How are you guys doing? Are you guys like still active? You're not dying from the heat yet, right?
We're up on another degree. I think I'm fine.
Yeah.
All right. So I figure at least from my questions, at least another 20, 25 minutes. Again, if chat has any questions about Griflins or Klei, feel free to leave them in the comments. And I'll give a last call warning for questions probably the next 15 minutes for everyone. So one aspect of Griflins that we haven't touched on yet that I want to bring up is kind of the replay value or the variance between the various runs. As we've said, one of the things that separates Griflins from other games is the length. That these are noticeably longer play times per run compared to some of the other deck builders that we've played. And because of that, that also has an influence on replay value. So, for like when I was playing the game, I saw a little bit of this, so I was hoping you guys can expand on it. In terms of like persistent elements or carryover that players can unlock between runs, what is available in Griflins for people watching us?
Perks, metal, card unlocks. Is there anything else?
Well, we have the flourishes that you unlock, sort of
too, yeah.
special finisher moves that you have to earn prestige points to unlock. So you do kind of expand what your character can do to some degree.
Mm-hmm. And do you guys have like an Ascension mode? I forget if this was one of the rulers that have it. Okay.
Yeah. It's actually like at the start of the game when you first start playing, you have a choice of kind of 3 difficulties. There's story mode, which kind of just it turns all the numbers down and it lets you kind of get on with it, if that's what you're interested in. And then there's kind of mode 0, these are the code names for them. I forget what we actually call them in
Prestige 0, yeah. It's
yeah, okay.
the name of that one.
There's 0 and 1. And 0 was the original starting point. And it's mechanically a little more simple. Like it's missing a lot of types of enemies that you can encounter and that kind of thing. And it's like every type of species has a species boon or bane, and they matter a lot more after Prestige 0. Prestige 0 is like, it's the entry point for people who want like the full card challenge, but maybe haven't played other games like this before, and they just want to figure out what's going on and do that one. And 1 is kind of like what I would call like the tuned default difficulty. Like if you've played Sled Spire, Monster Train, stuff like that before, you should probably start there, because like it's the full content. It's got all the stuff, and it's the one that kind of is meant for people who it assumes you know kind of what you're doing. Yeah, and we start out. There's a big full screen thing. It's like, okay, well, which player are you? Where do you want to start? And then once you start beating Prestige 1, then there's up to like 7, I think, in total.
All right. And one thing that I always like to ask developers when they have these systems in, how did you determine, I guess, what to give the player to start with and what to kind of hold back with kind of the persistent elements? Let's start with the cards first. I think that's the easiest for people to understand. Because card balance in these kinds of games, obviously, as I'm sure you guys are well aware of, can be very challenging in terms of, okay, what is the quote-unquote starter deck of what these characters look like, and then how do we take this into very different directions without just completely, overwhelming the player or just overcomplicating what our design is?
So when we were developing Sal and making all the cards for her, we originally didn't have card unlocks, because it was in development. There wasn't really a need for our purposes for that, but always with the intention of making those. And I think when we got to the point where it made sense to start making these packs, we made card packs that were themed in a certain way that would make them more interesting and kind of hopefully give the player an idea of what they want to do with them when they unlock them. The best case scenario is they finish a run, they get a card pack, and they're like, oh, I got to start another one because I want to get those cards. But we also made sure to take some of the more complex cards, or complicated, the ones that take a little more strategy to get working correctly, and put those further down the line. Generally not necessarily more powerful cards, but definitely cards that had a higher skill ceiling. Like you say, in order to not overwhelm players with mechanics that might be a little bit complicated if you're brand new to the game. Our rarity system also kind of helps with that, and that a lot of the complicated cards are uncommon or rare. So they won't show up in the first draft for the player. They'll usually start showing up if you get lucky around day 2 or day 3. So naturally, even if it's the player's first game, they get to the complicated cards a bit later into it, once they've had a couple of battles, sort of gotten to know the character.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of like the metal and kind of the perk systems, where did those two systems come from, and like what was the approach of putting them in the game?
I mean, it was relatively late in development that we added those. Like the game was pretty much balanced before they were added, and they kind of came from us looking at our metrics and seeing that, like, players who at the time unlocked Prestige 1 were much more likely to play more Griftlands. Like there was like this big filter of like, people who played a little bit of 0, and then if you get past that, then you play a lot more. So it was an attempt to get to kind of scaffold people up the prestige chain to experience the full game. So you would get subtly better at the game, kind of just numerically, because you're picking these perks, you're picking this metal stuff. And then at the same time, you would then kind of balance that by upping the prestige point, and it would more or less kind of balance out as you worked your way up the chain until Prestige 7, when we take that all away, and that's like the hardest mode that is available to you.
All right. Let's see. A question from Very Russian Corn want to know: is there any possibility of a DLC in the future? Any particular plans you'll be able to disclose with us?
I don't think we're allowed to say anything about that, sadly. I mean, everything's based on popularity and sales, and yeah.
So, with kind of the replayability from the story point of view and kind of that kind of content, you mentioned, of course, how different characters can show up and things along those lines. And of course, there are random events that can happen. I guess here's a quick question from like a programming or just a design standpoint. The events that can occur as you're moving from one point of interest to another on the map, are those like randomly chosen, or are they kind of dictated like as a pool from like the start of when you begin a new game?
It's a little both. So like there's kind of a mainline quest that defines like Sal. And Sal's got 5 days. Sal's got a quest, kind of drilled down. She's got a quest for day one, and day one has a certain structure. It starts out by offering you a bunch of jobs, and those jobs come from a certain pool, and the pool is much bigger than the number of jobs that you're offered. And then the RNG for picking those jobs for which ones get spawned actually takes into event which ones you've seen before and which ones you played, and it tries to show you all the content before it shows you content again. And that's pretty important for making the game feel like it makes the game feel a lot more expansive, because you don't see like, oh, it's that quest again, that quest again, that quest again. Assuming we fill those pools large enough, right? And then it also has like points like between the time you pick this job up and the time that you finish that job, there will be a random travel event, and when we spawn that random travel event, there's an even bigger pool of random travel event jobs, which again, same system, tries to show you something that is okay. So they all validate to make sure this is possible to happen right now. Like some are that they have to be early in the story, some are late in the story, some require you need to have an admiralty friend or a spree enemy or something, right? And then it tries to cast characters into it, and it tries to cast them in an interesting way. Like often a quest will be designed that if you have a friend who is of an appropriate level and isn't busy otherwise, we'll use that friend in that quest, because that just makes it interesting. And then there's some switches in the dialogue to kind of acknowledge the fact and kind of drive home to the player that yes, this is someone that and there's some stakes there to it. But it also has a fall through, like if you don't have that yet, because otherwise the quest wouldn't spawn very often. It will just spawn someone, and the dialogue's slightly different, and then you see it. But yeah, so the Sal's quest will say like she's going to have like I forget the number, like two or three random travel events on day one, and they'll happen approximately these times. But given which particular event, it's going to be based on those pools and how those random numbers go. Yeah, so it's very much picking from pools and trying to cast agent, we call them characters in the game, to kind of maximize interest.
Okay. And in terms of, I guess, like having like the campaign structure, the day structure for each character, I guess when like it was time to actually like settle down and develop the campaign for each character, like did the day system kind of like help frame what you wanted to do, or did you come up with like the overall story start to finish and then say, okay, we want to separate this into day one, day two, day three, that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, Sal was very iterative, to use that word again. Once we had kind of Sal in the bag, then I mean, generally it would be our writer would come up with an idea for like, what are the factions involved, and like some of the characters. There'd be some documents there, and then I'd work with them and parcel it out into, okay, well, there's gonna be this types of job quests and this many whatever, and then we'll split that into a certain number of days, and a day should take a certain amount of time for the player. And it ends with a boss. Bosses are pretty important to the design because they're kind of the gate checks for your decks every so often. They're also, they're fun to fight against. They're big and impressive looking. So yeah, like once we had that in place, we would kind of write. Okay, so if you played early access at all, you'd be familiar with the placeholder text. Often the quest would go in, and I would just and it would be pretty out there placeholder text, just you know, eventually to be replaced by Shannon, our writer, much better than what I put in. But yeah, like we would get the structure in, and we would start tuning the structure. People would play that, and they'd laugh at the bad dad jokes that I put in. And then over time, those would get replaced with, like, once they've settled down, we're like, yes, we actually want this thing. They would get replaced with actual text. And that's where, like, the nuance, the character interactions would come in. And then, of course, when we first designed a character, we would put the bare minimum number of jobs so that you could play. Like if you do 3 jobs, we would make 3 in the pool, and you'd see each of them every time. And then once that was working, once the whole what was going to be released was working, then we would make alternate jobs that could be added to the pool to spice it up and make it different from playthrough to playthrough.
Okay. Let's see. A Fairy Russian Corn wants they want a placeholder text mode.
It's like Tears in the Rain. That stuff's gone. Sorry.
Let's see. I'm trying to think. There's anything else gameplay wise. I do have a few like early access general questions for both of you, but I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we haven't hit on in terms of gameplay. And for chat watching, this will probably be officially last call for questions, because as soon as we're done with like kind of like discussing early access, we'll begin to wrap things up. I guess for either of you, anything that we haven't touched on regarding card design, gameplay, anything along those lines that you'd like to bring up?
I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say we talked a little bit about developing both attacks for enemies, but also cards for characters. And I think a big thing for us in developing cards for Rook and Smith was that we wanted it to feel different from Sal. And one of the ways it does that is, Rook has the charges on his gun, he has the coin that he flips, and sort of getting in this core identity for the characters was really, really useful for us in figuring out what direction we were going. And it also, I think, helps make the characters feel different, regardless of the cards they're using, right? They're all going to have a card that costs 1 and just deals a bit of damage, but having that flavor there really helped differentiate the characters.
Were there any, like, saying about that, were there any other characters you guys came up with that you were hoping to put into Griflins that just unfortunately didn't make the cut?
That's dangerous for the fan community. I mean, there's always, like, to various degrees of completion. There's like, oh, this character might be a 4th character, a 5th character, whatever. Smith started as that. Rook started as that. There's like a robot or something. Yeah, it's again, it's very dangerous. Though people will fixate upon it.
All right. Let's see. Got a question in chat. Before I forget this question, because it just came in my mind about the gameplay side. Regarding kind of the shops or extended features that you build into each campaign, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about like what you want to like provide the player in terms of services. So from when I played as Sal, I saw, of course, you can get a pet. You can, of course, hire people to help you for a day. You can get additional graph spaces. You can, upgrade your pet. What was kind of like how did you approach like the additional options you want to provide the player with?
I think Sal has the prototype for all of them in there. Again, it's just as we were playing, it's like, oh, it'd be really nice to be able to, go shopping at the end of the day, and like, what are you going to use this money for? So we come up with the night market, and then when the other characters came in, it's like, well, we need to have the night market, and they need to be the same characters because people are kind of used to them now. So that came in that way. It's basically just anything that you could need, we needed to give you access to, and then we would usually either time limit it or have a trade-off. Like when you heal to eat, or when you eat to heal, you get gassy and burpy. Have junk cards. So like, yeah, nothing's free in the Griftlands.
I think it was also in large part to always give the player a chance. The night market shows up before bosses, so you always like, oh, maybe I can get to the market, I can get a really good card, and that will help me. The drinks and food are always available. because if you happen to get really unlucky or you made some mistakes, you can always go back, and while there is a disadvantage to eating, at least you're not dead, right? So it was kind of like to help players get back on course whenever they failed a little bit.
So here's a question I got to ask. I'm sure this will also give some fans some excitement. What do you guys have a favorite pet that you like to hire when the time comes?
The biped robots are always fun as pets because you're like, that's not a pet.
Actually, I do. Specifically, a rock named Turnip. We took a bunch of the names of pets of people at Klei and used them as names, and Turnip is one of them.
So do you like the pet or do you like the actual dog Turnip?
Just the Griftlands pet.
Oh no,
both.
Shots fired.
And rocks were also one of the first things we had for Sal. It was rocks and coyotes that were the first.
Yeah, they're really early. Yeah.
Yeah, so they have a special place in my heart.
Oh, there's that one. You can only see it in the debug tools. There's this one frame of like this wolf dog thing. He's cool.
Oh yeah.
It was just concept art that was placeholder.
All right. Let's see. A few questions came in. Grand Manon, hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly, said, the animation is super interesting and it's amazing how efficient you were with the different pieces of the character rigs and poses. How did you guys tackle that, or was it built from the old RPG ashes?
Well, that's the Klei animation pipeline that we've been using since Shank days, more or less, right? Like I think there's actually on YouTube there's a GDC talk given by Aaron and Jeff. Aaron was one of the animators on when people animated Griftlands, which goes into detail about how we separate out builds and anims and use skinning and whatever to get them to show. And yeah, like there actually isn't that much conversational animation in the game, but like there's a lot of builds, like different faces and bodies and stuff. And then in combat, there's a lot of combat animation where like that's where you try to like we reuse character to character as much as we can, but then we try to make signature moves and idols and stuff to kind of like bring out the character to the fore.
Okay. They also ask, whatever happened to Grendel or whatever the robot's name was? Gradle?
Gradle. Yeah. I think he retired to party with Steven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's canon now.
Yeah, it's just making canon fly.
Let's see. They also ask, any plans for other media in the Griflins universe, like comics, animated shorts, etc.?
Well, I'm not capable of doing any of those things, so not by me. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like spiritually, like that part of that lore is probably going to be in whatever like I do next a little bit. Like it may not be canonically the same thing, but a lot of the ideas will carry over. I really like kind of like the relationship system and the dynamic casting quest and stuff. But yeah.
I think that's a very interesting point. I think that's one thing that Klei has done really well, is that your art style is so unique and iconic that I think a lot of people do love that idea of like having that extended media. I know, the very shorts from Don't Starve. They mentioned the Hot Lava comics. I remember like the first time I saw like the intro to the animated cartoon for that one, which was hilarious.
Yeah, I'm just very lucky to work with people more talented than I am, right? Like like the sound people, the programmers, the writers, the artists, everybody. That's how you succeed in life, is you find other people who are really good at stuff and then you follow them.
Let's see. A very Russian Corn asks, why did you give upgraded fleets a gun? Why would you give a bug dog a gun?
I mean, they wanted it.
Yeah. Seems like natural progression to me.
Yeah.
All right. I think with that, I have a few just general early access questions for both of you, and then I will let you go for today. At some point, I do want to have like an updated chat about Auction Not Included, because I know I have quite a few fans of that one. If we put that one on here, that's like another like 2 hours, I'm sure easily. I think we'll all be roasted by then. But
Yeah,
with early access, we said like Klei has really like gone on, or they really have approached early access as a major point about development. And one of the challenges that I see from a lot of developers is knowing when to go on it. And I know with Klei in particular, like you guys typically wait until projects are further along than I think a lot of other developers do. And for any designers or students watching, I just wanted to ask if you both could like elaborate on what is the decision like to go on to early access versus waiting and letting the game stay in development a little bit longer behind the scenes.
I think you never get a second first impression, right?
Yeah.
So like it has to, for us at least, like it has to give you a certain amount of content, like certain number of hours of play. And it's not a specific number, but like we need to look at the game and say like, oh yeah, you can play this for like 4 hours, 8 hours, something like that, and like you get a good amount of play for your money at this point. And then it also has to be polished to a certain, for us at least, like polished to a certain degree. Because like once you put a screenshot out there, that might be the lead screenshot on a journalist site for the game once it's released, right? So like you can't take it back once it's out there. So like we always want to get like a certain degree of polish, certain degree of like it's not going to crash, and then also like a certain degree of knowing what is fixed and what will change. So like had we gone early access to the Griftlands when it was the crazy sprawling game with no direction, we'd be in trouble, right? Because like you're at that point you're selling your fans one thing, and then you're saying actually no, it's going to be this other thing now, and I hope you like it. So so like we had to wait, we had to get all that out of our system, and get it to the point where like we know that like okay, it's a deck building game, it's got 2 decks. Was Cell Story complete when we no, it wasn't, right? It was,
Was
it was
not, no.
almost, yeah, it was missing the last day, I think.
Yeah.
So but you had a certain amount of play that you could do. And we had a plan for like I think we took 2 years total in early access on various platforms. Like we're gonna add the other characters, and then whatever systemic problems we need to fix, like by adding metal or all the little things we did along the way to make the game better based on the feedback that we received. Like they're within a certain bounds. They're not going to be like, and then it's a first person shooter, on this level. So like once you can answer all those questions, and you've given it to people that you know and trust their opinion, and gotten feedback from them that yes, they like playing it. It is a game that they enjoyed, not something they're just playing as a favor to you. That's when I think you're ready to launch.
Mhm. And yeah, as we've said, like it's very tricky to know, as you were saying, like about in terms of how much of the game was already realized. Like you won't go into early access and then say, "Oh, we're changing this into a first-person shooter. This is going to be now an open space game. Enjoy this version." And it is very tricky, I think, to manage that kind of pipeline in terms of having new content, playtesting, and make sure everything works. I know one of the things that Klei does that I'm sure everyone watching this is well aware of is, of course, that you guys give timeline breakdowns of when there's going to be a new major update. I saw, when I was doing the Don't Starve beta, Oxygen, and so on, 27 days until next update, 75 days, whatever. And hey, Soren, thanks for joining as well. How did you like from a development standpoint? This may be too big of a question again to hear, but how do you decide, like in terms of like the scope? Okay, we're going to tell everyone 37 days for our next major content, or the next one will be 22 days, or whatever.
Well, you generally pick a cadence, right? So
Mhm.
like on Grifflands, I mean the cadence can change too over time. Like I think we were doing, what were we doing? We're doing 4 weeks, 3 weeks.
At the end, we were doing 4 weeks. Yeah.
We were doing 4 weeks, yeah. So like Early on, you might go faster than that. You might go every 2 weeks. You generally have fewer players there, and there's less to break, and people will cut you more of a break if you break stuff. So you can go a little faster. But yeah, like you just set your cadence, and then a week. Generally, the cadence should be at least 2 weeks, and then like that week before release, you branch off, and that's the release candidate. You do whatever testing you do. We tend to have like 2 branches on Steam when we do this, so like we'll have like an experimental branch that you can go and play on, or on Epic as well. And then that's where like your super fans will go in and they'll be really keen to see like the content and want to try it out, and like they'll tell you a lot about what's broken very quickly. And it's your chance kind of to fix that and stabilize that, and then you bring those changes back to the core branch, and then you just release. And like I think the more important thing to tell people is the date, rather than the specific content of the release, because you don't necessarily know what the content's going to be or what you can get done, and you might have to cut something at the last minute or push it off to the next one. And like the difference between early access being kind of chill and early access being this unending grind of stress, is having that ability to push out features to the next update. Because I think players, like, as long as they see you working, as long as they see progress being made in the game, and you can explain yourself and you're open to people, and you say, yeah, we're working on this, and generally, if you say you're working on something, it should be coming up relatively soon, and for sure. But yeah, as long as you keep that, like, it's more important to have smaller updates, at least in the early part, smaller updates more often and on a regular schedule, and be very reliable about that, than to be like, we're getting weather systems in on this day, or whatever your particular game has, because getting that particular thing right on a particular day can be very hard in game development.
For sure. And this next question is for Rasmus. As you said, like, Griflins was kind of your first commercial project, and I'm assuming it was your first development during or building a game in early access. And I wanted to ask, like, what were your thoughts on developing a game on early access like this? Because you said you worked on game jams as well, and I think early access is still like a very like mysterious thing for a lot of developers getting into the game industry.
Yeah, well, it was definitely interesting and exciting. It was very weird to have sort of like a launch for early access. Like, you are releasing the game, but you're also not really, right? So it was really cool to get it out there and to have people play it. But it was also very comforting to know that it was a smaller group of people, and it was people who generally were fans of Klei or were very into this type of games. It was generally people who would have a positive experience, and you always want your players to enjoy what they're playing. And I think having that constant feedback from players whenever we put out something new was super helpful in validating our decisions. Whenever we put out a new feature, we're like, well, maybe this will work. Getting that positive feedback was like, okay, this is the right direction. It's not just something because if you're sitting in a small group of people developing a game and nobody else sees it, it's very easy to get in this echo chamber of like, yeah, no, this is really good, and then you put it out to players and like, yeah, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was really good to design it, but not very good to play it. I think our experimental branch was very useful for that, because we updated that almost daily at the start. Yeah. So we got instant feedback from people who are like, no, this is really bad, or people getting super excited.
It lets you make mistakes, right?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
And it lets you be a little bit more risky when you're trying out a new feature, and you can kind of push it a little further than you maybe otherwise would, and then reel it back in depending on the reaction.
Yeah.
I mean, we also have like invaluable. This is new for this game. We haven't had it before, but you press F8 at any time in the game, pops up a screen where you type in your thoughts, and then we see that in a Slack channel. Very handy for finding bugs, things people like, things people don't like. So good.
Yeah, I'm actually just curious about that for a second. Like, was that used very readily by the fans and by the people who played the early access?
Yeah.
It was used quite a lot, especially like right when we launched into early access. I remember waking up the next day and having hundreds of things to look through. But like it was it was a lot of work to sort of filter out what was just hey, good game, and what was useful information. But it was also hugely valuable to picking the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, also gives you repo steps for a bug too. They're like, this card didn't work properly, and there's save games there, and the screenshots there, and the log is there. Just drag it into your game and fix the problem, push it out. And like on the experimental branch, because we're pushing daily, like we could almost fix people's bugs in real time, which was kind of a strange experience.
Yeah. And I think that's very fascinating about like that kind of getting that feedback and just like that immediate idea of what people are thinking about your game. Because I remember, I think when we spoke a few years ago during Don't Starve, that we spoke about kind of like just how big it was to have like early access and be able to say, okay, we're going to post a build, we get all this feedback, we can use that instead of just as you guys were saying, just like talking amongst yourselves saying, do you like this feature? Oh yeah, I like it. This is perfect. Let's release the game just like this.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like the more feedback. I mean, you don't want all the feedback in the world right at the beginning. You want to kind of open the tap slowly, right? And that's what early access gives you generally, because your audience starts small and grows over time.
And like we said, the game is also at that point where you know what you want the game to be. It's not that you're trying to guess, okay, where's this game want to go? You can kind of weigh that with a decision. Because I'm sure, like with any time you have customer feedback, that you probably got dozens and dozens of suggestions of we want this in the game, we want that, and you have to weigh that between, okay, what do we want to do and what can we feasibly do? Because I'm sure somebody suggested, let's just turn this into that open world first person shooter RPG visual novel strategy game.
Yeah, I mean, you see patterns, you see aggregates. Like if one person says something subjective, and you're like, okay, that's cool, that's your opinion. But if you see that a lot and a lot and a lot, then you're like, oh, okay, maybe there's something to this, and then you can kind of like talk to the team and take it under consideration and think, well, what is our plan around this? Like, are we going to address? Are we going to add this thing? Are we not pointedly not going to add this thing? Is it some underlying problem with the game we need to fix that is causing people to think that they want this particular feature? Like it just starts the conversation and provides a bit of some data points for justifying your decisions later.
Oh yes, for sure. And to a newbie Spud comment about being very rewarding to see that turnaround. Yeah, again, as you guys said, like one of the big points about early access is that you want, like, people want to see that there's progress. They want to see that if the game is like this on patch 1, it's now here, maybe patch 3, and it is very tough, I think, for a lot of developers who don't start in early access or haven't really have that background to do it for their first game. So, like, for them watching, do you guys have any tips or any like survival guide strategies for launching a game in early access?
Yeah,
I think
just pay yourself.
I think having sort of related to the previous question as well, having multiple sources of feedback is really useful. We read all of the reports from our feedback system, but also there's the Klei forums where multiple people would discuss with each other, and you get a much more nuanced idea of what people are actually feeling. There's a fan Discord that started really early, and there's always a lot of good conversations in there. So you can kind of, if there's opinions you don't agree with, and you can kind of see what other people are thinking in there. So you don't start working on a bunch of stuff that turns out to not be necessary.
Yeah, and I think it's most important skill is listening. Like number one thing you shouldn't do is like wade into the Discord and say, no, actually, what you're feeling is wrong. This is what the game is. Like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Nothing good will happen from that. Just watch, just listen, discuss it with your trusted friends, with your colleagues. Keep the barriers up to a degree.
Also evaluating what is worth it and what's not, because even though something might be a good idea, you can't do everything. You can't make the perfect game for everyone. So you got to figure out what is actually worth making, and that can be a challenge.
Yep. So I think with that we are over an hour and a half. I'm pretty sure I'm just about out of questions. I would love to pick your brain about kind of like the growth of Don't Starve and Actually Not Included, but again, that's who knows how many more hours of talking we can do here. Um, I guess before we go, anything else regarding, somehow have we missed anything else regarding Griftlands that either of you want to bring up?
Just big thank you to everyone who worked on it, and everyone who played it and gave feedback. And yeah, like I don't know if there's much room for altruism in games. Like it is a collective effort, definitely, and you need no one person has all the skills they need to make something like Griftlands. So like I'm just very thankful to work with very talented people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, close enough. Since you just joined, if you do have any like last minute questions, I'll give you like one shot to get them in because we are just about at the end. And yeah, no problem, Fairy Russian Corn. Thank you to everyone who's joined, especially those of you watching from the fan Discord. And like I said earlier, if you do enjoy learning about game design and indie games, feel free to subscribe. And we have our own Discord channel that should be in all the descriptions of these casts. Let's see. Okay, so Close Enough asks, as Sal, was Bleed meant to be so easy to build into and almost be a battle deck for every run? I've done polls on Rag, and most people agree Bleed is easy and the best archetype to build into.
That's an interesting question. Bleed was one of the first mechanics Sal had. At the start, it was Bleed and combo. A very different combo from the combo we have now. Actually, we've gone through a lot of iterations to get combo feeling good. I think Bleed isn't meant. There isn't for any of the characters meant to be a default deck. There's kind of, generally speaking, there's two simple archetypes, and then there's a third that's a little bit more complex, but also hopefully more interesting. For Sal, that third one is discard, which I think has a fairly low barrier to entry, but it is more complex than Bleed and combo. And I think a lot of people fall into Bleed because just logically, it's a very easy thing to understand, right? All of the cards deal damage, and you apply a debuff that deals more damage, and it just kind of works, right? Where combo, you have to do a little bit more planning to make sure that you have the resources that you need. I think a good Bleed deck kind of has to take into consideration the same things, because you need to use that Bleed for something as well. But yeah, I think there will always be one particular type of deck that players gravitate towards, either because it's the most fun or because it's the easiest to kind of get started. Because it's always a concern in deck builders, right? You want to start building your deck immediately. Yeah.
All right. So if anyone new is joining, I guess final call, because we'll be wrapping something like the next minute. So if you have any other questions, please get them in. While we wait to see if anything comes in, I guess in terms of for people watching, do you have any if they want to follow you, follow Klei? If you have any social media you'd like to promote, feel free.
We're both weirdos who aren't really on social media.
Personally, no. There is a Klei Discord that launched recently. Pretty popular. If you're a fan of Griftlands, there's also a fan Discord, I believe.
Yep.
I don't actually know how to find that, but
I know it
should be fairly easy. There's also the Klei forums where there's always great discussion, and you're sure to at least have your questions read there. try to take that into account.
Okay. Looks like a few questions did come in. Gramanon asks, do the devs know how much we love them?
Aw. Thanks.
That's very nice.
And Bezka asks, are daily challenges pre-written for the next week, or do you come up with new ones every now and then?
There's a pool of mechanics that kind of mix and match on a seeded random number based on the date. So you can tell from the code, you can figure out what a given daily challenge will be 100 years from now. But yeah, we don't like sit down and schedule it out. It's based on that random number generator.
Yeah, they're also sort of mixed together of a bunch of different things. Like there is a quest there, but then the challenges, the feats that you get, that challenge you, and the mutators that you get are also picked from pools. So there's a lot of different variations of each quest that it sort of cycles through.
It's how it can work offline.
All right. And of course, it was asked earlier if you have any DLC plans. You couldn't tease anything out. Do you have any updates? Any new things you guys are working on, or is that still mysterious?
Purposefully mysterious. We are working on a project right now, but we can't talk about it.
All right. Very Russian Corn asked, any plans for merchandising for Griftlands?
I don't know. I'd have to talk to a merchandising person. I hope so, because that'd be neat.
One last gameplay question came from me, and then I promise I won't ask any more gameplay in case we bloom this out. Regarding the Ascension modes, how did you guys decide what you wanted to kind of tier each mode or each level to?
We changed it a couple of times, actually. We used to have many more levels, and they were very granular, and it took forever to get to the end of it. And then we decided to I mean, there's just so much gameplay that it would that's too much. It's dozens and dozens and dozens of hours. So we actually shrunk the number down in order to make them more impactful. And I think I went through and thought of themes, tried to come up with a catchy name for them each, and yeah. Again, iteration. It's getting to answer most questions.
All right, so my final question then is, do you guys have anything you'd like to say to the fans? Because I'm sure, as we figure out, plenty of them are watching this live right now. I'm sure a few of them are watching this recorded.
Thank you. It's such a privilege and an honor to have people play the thing you made. Why we're in games.
Yeah, a huge thank you to everyone. Whether it's the people posting tons of fan art, or just the people who are around and say hi on the Discord and stuff like that. Everyone is. It's been a very pleasant experience to interact with the community. Yeah.
All right.
Especially during this time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think with that, again, if I wanted to, I can certainly pull up questions from Don't Starve and Auction Not Included, but we are almost at 2 hours for our quote-unquote little talks, so I think we'll end things here. So, Kevin, Rasmus, thank you so much for coming on tonight. If you wouldn't mind hanging on the call for 30 seconds after we're done, just have a few things to go over with you. And yeah, again, congratulations on the release of Griflins and whatever mysterious secret projects you have coming up.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here.
All right. So, for those of you watching, thank you so much for joining us, whether you're watching this live or recorded. Thank you to everybody from the fan Discord and the new people watching. As I said earlier, if you are interested in learning about game design and lots of indie games, feel free to subscribe to the channel, check out our Discord, Patreon, all that good stuff. It's linked down below. And if you are a developer working on an upcoming game and you'd like to come on to talk about or just talk design, we're always looking for guests for these future casts. With that said, I'll be back later on tonight for my regular game streams, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.